It's a team-based effort, but you need to have an architect at the front of that, driving and leading that.
Michael Clark is the design director of Hadley Property Group, one of London's most progressive and ambitious property developers.
Michael is an architect and urban designer by profession and now uses his breadth of experience to manage the design teams delivering large-scale urban regeneration projects.
Has contracting got tougher?
We're living in a difficult time.
How long it's going to take from when they purchase the site to when they sell the home is 8.5 years.
It's a slow process at the moment. Ultimately, our business is to deliver homes, and we have a housing crisis. We need things done now. But now you've got these three fairly substantial financial hurdles.
You're overtaxing the golden goose.
I think it's going to take the public an awful long time to not see developers as just basically the devil incarnate, which of course we're not.
What makes Hadley unique?
I think we've got commitment to spending time and energy understanding what that community needs and therefore building that into our emerging designs.
Michael, thank you so much for joining today.
Pleasure.
Your career from architect into contracting and now working for development, I think can tell us something about architecture and the profession today. What do you think it says?
Well, architecture has always been a bit of an up and down career. You have highs and you have lows, peaks and troughs. I think eventually you become slightly disenfranchised as a consequence and you look for other opportunities. I think there's a lot of architects have left the profession. I think there's an awful lot of architects who have moved sideways, like I did. There's a lot of architects who've gone away and done something completely different. I think architecture is, on the face of it, it looks like the best job ever. I think when you actually get into it and you start running a business, you realise that it's incredibly hard work, can be incredibly disappointing, and I think a lot of people get frustrated by that. So it's, it promises a lot but doesn't necessarily deliver.
Can you remember the moment where you first thought, this is disappointing, I need to get out?
Well, I arrived in London on the 6th of October in 1987, and the following Friday we had what was called Black Friday, and the markets crashed. I think that was my first disappointment. I'd moved all the way down to London with the view that it was going to make me safe for the future. And you realise very quickly that even working in a capital city, when everything seemed to be tickety-boo, the economic forces that are at play make this job not as safe as it could be, and therefore I knew right from the beginning it was always going to be a challenge.
Contracting seems like it's possibly even more vulnerable to the financial macroeconomic situation. Is that not? I mean, did you not find that was, you were just as vulnerable there?
I don't think so. I think I went to work for Lang O'Rourke. Lang O'Rourke had a multi-billion pound organisation with huge projects across a variety of different disciplines. So they didn't have all their eggs in, shall we say, one architectural basket. There was always work at Lang O'Rourke. There was always the opportunity to use, and I wasn't really working as an architect then. I was kind of part of what they called the engineering excellence team, which were each of the disciplines working towards delivering modern methods of construction. So we were doing that in prisons, in hospitals, in residential schemes, in all types of different buildings. So if there was a fallow period in commercial office space, there'd be something else happening in the public sector. So you were kind of slightly immune from the more day-to-day challenges of the architectural profession.
We have seen the collapse of a couple of big contractors, and I predict that there'll be a few more. What do you think that says about, has contracting got tougher since the period of time that you were at Lang O'Rourke, or were these companies that were just, practicing bad practice?
I think there's a bit of both. I think you can certainly look at major contractors who have been very poor at housekeeping, very poor at quality, and perhaps very poor at bidding sensibly. We live in a world, however, where the race to the bottom is a daily grind. I think there's a lot of contractors who are constantly forced to bid for projects below what they genuinely believe the price to be to get those projects, and will then work doubly hard with design teams and alternative approaches to try and make money. And it's a very, very challenging time for contractors to do that at the moment.
Do you find now that you're a developer that there's a tendency towards a sort of equal and opposite effect where, you get the same effect if a developer overpays for a site, where you're suddenly fighting a very hard battle? And it does seem like a lot of sites, particularly in London, are underwater.
Yeah, no, there are. And, we're living in a difficult time where there's an awful lot of projects not happening because sites were bought at the top of the market, designs were delivered prior to the Building Safety Act and BS 991 and all that comes with it, and people are having to rethink both the design and the value. Our business, the Hadley Property Group, I think they've been very astute in terms of what they've bought and where they are. I think that's given us a little bit more freedom, a little bit more room, space, shall we say, to select the right kind of projects. We're constantly looking at new opportunities and we're valuing them and we're putting together schemes and we're bidding for the sites. But actually there's not really much coming back because those sites were bought at a premium and people are trying to sell them to cover their losses, and that kind of doesn't really work. We're not going to be buying things for more than the value.
What's this sort of setup of Hadley, for those who don't know it? What's the kind of the structure of the organisation? What's its modus operandi in terms of a development kind of cycle? Well,
it's a reasonably small business. There only are 3 dozen of us, and in terms of the big developers, that's a small number. But actually, it makes us incredibly nimble. We've got very much a focus on the London boroughs. We've very much got a focus on working with the London boroughs, with the local authorities on delivering residential-led schemes. We've got a very strong, and one of the things that attracted me to this business, a very strong kind of comms and outreach team. We do an awful lot of upfront work with community, with local groups, with stakeholders, to write briefs to a point where when we appoint design teams, they're delivering something which is specific and focused on that site, that context and those people. And I think the local authorities and the communities very much, they value that incredibly highly, and rightly so, because there's an awful lot of developers I don't think do that. So, historically, 10 years ago we probably delivered lots. Then there was a quiet period when investors were looking for, I suppose, their money, the returns much quicker. The market's changed again. I think developers are finding that finance is happier in the long term. So we'll be changing, and because we're a small private organisation, we've got the ability to move quite quickly and be quite nimble.
You must be quite popular at the moment if you're delivering residential-led schemes, because certainly in London, there's a great shortage of people bringing forward C3 housing. How are you finding it?
Well, again, we're finding it like every residential developer. We'd love to be starting more schemes. The viability issue is one which is troubling us all. That's a number of issues there related to construction costs, material costs, inflation, borrowing, the ability for people to get mortgages, and the 35% affordable quota. We keep hearing of the Building Safety Act slowing things down. We know that planning is a long and lengthy process. It's difficult to make things happen at the moment. Yes, people were desperate to see businesses like ours deliver homes, but it's a slow process at the moment, and no one's able to move things quicker. And we've just got to kind of, I suppose, batten down the hatches and hold on tightly whilst we work our way through this slightly more painful process than normal. But ultimately, our business is to deliver homes, and we have a housing crisis. So, we're right in the middle of all that, trying to do what we can to do our part.
I was with another, I suppose, a medium-sized developer recently, and they were saying now when they kind of go to their investors at the start of a project, their kind of underwrite position of how long it's going to take from when they purchase the site to when they sell the homes is 8.5 years.
Yeah, and I think, maybe 2 years ago it was 7.5 years, and 5 years ago it might have been 5 years. It seems to go out all the time, and I'll go back to what I said about, the planning process, the Building Safety Act, all of the kind of complications in terms of the London plan and the requirements for almost every stakeholder there is in the world now has got the opportunity, rightly or wrongly, to for us to respond to their queries and deliver information. So the planning process is a much more complicated one now, and means that the timescales and the program lengths between starting and handing something over are incredibly long. We need things done now. I mean, on the big site that we've just put planning in out at Brentford, one of the asks there are that we include things like medical centres, dentists and doctors. And you have to say to the people, we'd love to, but you realise they won't come on stream for 7 or 8 years. And of course, people are talking about needing dentists, doctors and homes today. So, we're always trying to play catch up, which isn't very easy.
If you had a magic wand that made delivering housing in London easier, do you think you would wave it over the building safety regulator? Would you wave it over the planners? What would be, if you had a couple of levers, the ones that you think would make the most difference?
Well, I personally don't have a problem at all with the building safety regulator. Yes, it's taking a bit longer than it might have done, but in essence, every architect is doing now what they used to do 25 years ago, and in fact what they've always been doing, which is designing buildings in line with building regulations. So the Building Safety Act has brought in another gateway which requires information to be delivered prior to starting on site. Nothing wrong with that. That reduces risk, it reduces tender prices. Actually, it gives developers a little bit more certainty in terms of the delivery of the product. So I wouldn't wave any wand at that. Planning, I think there is possibly far too many parts of a planning application now that have just been added on and added on and added on. My magic wand would be either about 35% as affordable, or Section 106, or SIL. I mean, these are 3 very substantial additional costs that developers have to bear now that they never did before. I mean, when I started, I think 106s didn't exist. But now you've got these 3 fairly substantial financial hurdles. And it were almost like you could say you're only allowed 2. Which 2 are they?
Yeah. I agree. I think it's, you're overtaxing the golden goose, and it's not necessarily in London got anything left to give. You've got to make developers incentivised to deliver housing by making it financially rewarding. Otherwise, why are they going to do it? And I mean,
there's a common misconception, and probably always has been, that developers are sitting on pots of gold and don't know what to do with their money. The reality is, every developer is desperately trying to make money, yes, but they're not going to do something which is going to lose money. And at the moment, I'd say that is a very fine line between making money and not making money. And nobody, no common sensed human being, would enter that level of risk against such large investments.
Property developers have one of the lowest trust ratings in the eyes of the public. Politicians actually fare better. So 2% of the population trust property developers. I think it was like 8% of the population trust politicians. Architects, no stats. Couldn't find any stats anyway, because I was interested. I thought maybe we could be the ones to try and like re-engage the built environment with people. But you've been an architect, a builder, and a developer effectively. What do you think property developers need to do to build trust with the public that might actually enable delivery of housing to happen at a greater scale?
It's an interesting one, because I don't think the public's perception of property developers will ever be great. I think most of our energies at the front end of projects, and I talked to you about how the Hadley team get out there into the community, it's persuading the community to sit and listen to what we say and what we're trying to do and get them on board, is the only way that people will start to generate that level of trust. And I felt when I joined Hadley, and this is what I did as an architect, was try and get, to the very roots of what the DNA of the place was and what the people were like. Once you start to understand the people and start to get them to understand what you're trying to do, you build up a level of trust, and actually you get everybody kind of pulling in the same direction. But there are far, far too many very bad examples of developers over the course of the last 30, 40, 50 years. I think it's going to take the public an awful long time to not see developers as just basically the devil incarnate, which of course we're not.
No, I mean, I think increasingly as developers are mostly made up of people from other professions, architects, QSs, engineers even, they're just people trying to build stuff for other people. To change the sort of focus slightly, What does a typical day look like for you at the moment in your current role at Hadley?
Well, it kind of changes through the phases of a project you're on. If you were to take the last 18 months of GSK, we employed 4 sets of architects, and there were 40 odd consultants involved in that planning application process. So my role was essentially, design director as a kind of a title, but what I was doing was kind of leading the team in terms of managing and coordinating all their efforts, although we had in Howard Tompkins a very good design team leader. It's a massive team, and you've therefore, in my position on behalf of Hadley, I'm kind of managing the input of all of these different consultants into achieving what we'd written down for them in the beginning was the vision for the site.
How do you think your mindset has had to shift now that you are not the architect? You're kind of the master controller of the architects. What has that meant for your personality, your mindset on a daily basis?
One thing, you cannot get too personally involved in design because it's no longer your design, it's everybody else's, albeit that as part of a team, everyone's equally responsible for it. But I kind of had to divorce myself from being too close to the design, to being able to see it in terms of the bigger picture, in terms of referring back to what the basic tenets of the brief might be, which is possibly about numbers, areas, efficiencies and all the rest of it, whilst trying to at the same time instill in the design team a view that even with tight budgets you can achieve wonderful architecture. So trying to keep the team kind of buoyant and positive through what is technically a very complex process now, but at the same time on behalf of the business, kind of controlling perhaps people's desires to be avant-garde.
Yeah, it's all within us. As somebody now who gets to appoint design teams and judge architects, what advice would you give architects about how they sell themselves to developers? I think it's something that as an industry we're not particularly good at.
Well, I think some are better than others. I mean, I always thought that Norman Foster wasn't a great architect, but he's a fantastic salesman. He's able to get people to believe in everything he says. I think one of the skills of an architect is to be able to get clients, planning authorities, the general public, whoever it is that you're getting your ideas across to absolutely understand where you're coming from, absolutely be wedded to what your narrative is and what you're trying to achieve. When I go and speak to architects, I want to find out what they're like as human beings. I mean, they've all got their certificates on the wall, but if we're going to invest in a substantial project, it's going to take a long time. You're going to spend a lot of time locked in a room with these people. You have to be able to get on and understand what their kind of, I suppose, hopes and fears are as well. So understanding the people, but also understanding their approach. I don't think architects look at the approach as much as they should do. They look at the end product a lot, but the route to get there, I think, is incredibly important. So I'm always interested in how architects design. What is the architect's process? How do they go from a blank sheet of paper to the first generation of ideas? And that goes back to understanding the DNA of the place and understanding what it is before you draw the first line. It's going to make that a narrative that people will buy into.
I think as an industry, we're quite bad at selling ourselves, the value of ourselves. And one of the ways that I think we give great value to a project, I think it's similar to what you're saying. We are able to articulate a narrative of why a design should be a certain way. And we need to understand from the developer's perspective what it is that financially makes sense for you. And then we need to understand what, from the planners and the politicians' perspective, they see great is. And we need to be the one that articulates how the two are connected.
Very much
how
so.
Can you create this win-win? And that's where our value is. And I think we should be better at articulating that is what we're doing.
I think so. And I think, developers and contractors, because so much of what we do, and this is one of the lessons I've learned from going from consultant to contractor to client, is it's all about teamwork. We all play a part in delivering either a world-class or a turkey. And therefore we've all got to be kind of committed to working together and being able to understand what each and every one of our requirements, business motivations, whatever they are, because the contractor doesn't want to have to do things twice. He wants to be able to do it once. Therefore, the design has to be fully coordinated. It has to be fully thought through, and the architect needs to have been appointed with a proper brief to enable them to deliver that. So, there's no kind of when something goes wrong, it's never any one person's fault. It's the fault of a kind of much bigger group of individuals or businesses.
What makes Hadley unique?
Well, I touched on the kind of the comms and the outreach team and being able to genuinely understand what, from the kind of grassroots level, the other requirements of a scheme are. Of course, it's about building efficient and beautiful homes, but there's always more to it. There's always more to the site and more to the neighbourhood and more to the community. And if you're ever going to try and deliver something which is based around the community, you have to kind of get to know that community well. And I think we've got very much a front-end skill set and commitment to spending time and energy understanding what that community needs and response will be, and therefore building that into our emerging designs.
So yeah, Matt Rimmer's actually been on the podcast before, and I think he's definitely part of. He spoke amazingly about how you can do that with communities and with businesses, and also then gain. It allows you to gain the trust of local politicians, who then will sort of empower planners to basically allow you to. All it takes is one barrier. And these schemes, they can be fragile. You have to get a lot of people to agree that it's something that everybody wants. And I do think that early engagement with political and community level is so important in making sure there isn't that one barrier that stops the whole thing. You say that gateways are not a problem, and I agree that the spirit of Gateway 2 applications is good. I think buildings should be fully coordinated before you get to site. I think it's slightly mutated and it's grown legs and a head, and it's, some of the things that we're being asked to provide up front are possibly more than you need to just say that the building is safe. Do you need 2 rounds of CFD analysis before you start on site? Don't know. But one of the pressures that it is putting on people is funding, because the traditional, the property industry is supported by people that would loan for developments. Yep. And they used to say, once you get your planning application, yes, you can start to draw down money for your fees. And that's the way the world worked. And now the world is working differently, because they're saying, no, you have to put your gateway application, that needs to be submitted and approved, and then you can draw down your funding. So you've basically got a funding gap, which can be £1 million, say, it is certainly on some of the sites that we're working on. How are you as a business approaching that funding gap, and don't you think that is something that is fundamentally problematic about the way that the gateways have been implemented? Yeah,
firstly, the Building Safety Act, no one's going to fault its intent. When at LREF yesterday and listening to the new head of the Building Safety Regulator, an ex-London fireman, with a very forthright and honest approach to, it's absolutely the right process, but the process is taking too long and we have to get around to fixing that. And I think that's going to be looked at in several different ways, because you're right, at the moment the funding doesn't necessarily kick in until much later on in the project, and a developer has to upfront pay for an awful lot more cost than they would have historically. But then again, you have to think about the long-term benefits of that. And I'll go back to the point about, if we fully design and coordinate a proper set of construction issue drawings practically, you've got a far better chance of getting a tender return which is full, complete, risk-free, and will give you a programme which is much more likely to be a positive one than a negative one. Historically, we started building on site when we were still coordinating. The design process hadn't been complete and mistakes were being made on the site, and you were, as architects, having to fix them as you went along, which is incredibly inefficient. So there's a change in the way the money's being spent and when it's being spent. But actually, if you look at the long-term benefits of that, you should end up in a better position at the end of all.
Yeah, if you have access to the money in the first place. It puts up a barrier to entry for any developers that aren't very cash rich, right? Because you're not going to bridge yourself. Well, you can. You could. That's what the typical lenders are saying now is, we'll lend you the money once you get your gateway, and you can bridge fund it from planning to the gateways at 12%, but that's very risky.
Yeah,
you don't know how
yeah.
long you're going to need to
Well,
borrow
and
it
it goes
for,
back
and it's
to-
very expensive.
Yeah, and it goes back to, this is one of the many issues in this kind of perfect storm that are delaying the starting of construction, because there are developers who obviously can't forward fund, aren't cash rich, or have got too many other things to get in line, and that takes a long period of time. So yeah, look, I'm not defending that. As I say, the Building Safety Act is there for all the right reasons. The process has to be streamlined, it has to be revisited, and I get the impression from the building safety regulator's words yesterday, they are doing exactly that. Unfortunately, it won't happen overnight. We all know that.
No, and I also think when things are hard, there's usually an opportunity there. And so our response to this was, we've hired a new head of technical who's a qualified PD, and we've built a technical team around him. And I think architects that don't get a very good technical team in place that can then advise back on what your planning applications need to look like are going to be lost. And particularly those companies that got used to doing planning apps and not delivering, they are going to be very lost, because you are needing to it's a different skill set to it was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It's so much more technical.
Yeah. No, you're right. And we talked about the knowledge gap that there is in the architectural industry. That's partly been brought about by the fact that what happened through the design and build procurement route was that the technical design was done by supply chain. And a lot of architects could only ever draw a kind of a scope and design intent. They weren't capable of bringing together all the component parts and giving you back a construction issue detail.
Well, I don't know if you still now are, you're not designing the component parts, but you certainly are having to put them all back into your 3D model and understand what they look like.
I think that's the point, is you need to understand them, and if they understand them earlier in the process, the more chance there is of a fully coordinated product being delivered on time to the right budget.
Don't you think it's interesting that a Gateway 2 application, if the technology didn't exist to model everything in 3D to the nth degree, basically you couldn't have the system that we now have. So one of my sort of beliefs is that compliance expands to the available technology that you have. So if you went 20 years back when I started my career, we did a planning application. I think it was like 5 A1 pieces of paper that were drawn. They were in CAD, but they were printed out and sent to the planning office, and that got planning, and that was probably a couple of £1 million. You go forward 10 years, and you've got some pretty heavy planning applications. You go to now, our planning applications are everybody's involved, and everybody's sending View City models to planners and getting their 3D models back. And this got complicated because we had the bandwidth for everyone to create all this stuff and hold it in digital stores and not have to actually send pieces of paper. And you get the gateways where now, insisting on basically building the building in 3D, okay, yes, it's good, but it kind of only can be done because this technology existed. What if Grenfell had happened before it was possible to 3D model everything? What would be the response then? How could you do this full coordination in advance before then? And will this continue to be the case that when AI starts to help with production, are we going to require even more and more and more and more and more information up front?
I don't think it's easy to answer that question. I mean, we're talking 20 years ago when there was very little computer technology used in delivering buildings. Now a huge amount of it. And yes, what's going to happen tomorrow? I don't think we quite know. I grew up on tracing paper and rotring pens. I have never been able to use a computer in terms of drafting and 3D modelling. Students have gone from being basic to incredibly advanced in terms of the use of digital technology. Does that make the process any easier? I think you've just rightly pointed out, in some respects it makes it more complicated because there's much more information and there's much more analysis and 3D work, which you would never have had before. Is the end product any better? Is it safer? Possibly not.
Is it better? Yeah, our building's a better quality than when... So apparently when Rogers went round the Lloyd's building, he walked in and the people that had commissioned him were like, wow, this space inside is so incredible. Like, why did you never tell us that it was going to be like this amazing kind of canyon of cathedral Gothic stuff? And he was like, well, I didn't really know either. Nobody had ever drawn it. They just drew some stuff and they all came together and it was just like, oh, bloody hell, that's good.
Well, there's no doubt about it. I mean, the advent of proper 3D modelling allows people to virtually be inside buildings before they're built.
But does it make them better? I think sometimes it makes them blander.
No, I don't think it does. And I think people can kid themselves with super graphics that things look brilliant, and they don't. I don't think AI, and I certainly don't think digital technology has improved architectural design. I'll go back to context and placemaking, and what is important about the building is as much to do with the public realm and the groundscape as it is to do with the architecture. Putting together wonderful CGIs only tell you kind of a little bit of the story, and I think people assume that a CGI equals great architecture. Well, it doesn't. It's an image of something which you kind of hope one day might look like that, but it's no guarantee.
Yeah. What do you think are the realistic chances that the UK can deliver 1.5 million homes over the next Parliament, given that we've already lost a year?
I think it's impossible. I think they're going to have to roll back on those numbers incredibly quickly. Even if all the projects that are kind of sitting in the planning stages at the moment all got their approvals in the next 18 months, you've still got to find the workforce, you've still got to find the materials, you've still got to find a whole raft of construction industry professionals to deliver all these things. And I don't think there are. I really don't think there are enough human beings out there to be able to deliver the numbers of units that we're talking about.
Do you think that since Labour government came in and talked about planning reform and did some minor planning reforms, the process of planning has changed?
No, and I don't think change doesn't happen overnight in this industry. There's always a length of time.
Do you think attitudes have changed, though? Because I think they have a bit.
It's hard to say. You can't directly compare two governments side by side with the same project. It's always different projects at different times. We do know, if you take London, where most of the boroughs are Labour controlled, and most of the boroughs are supporting, and the government supporting them, the house building targets, there is certainly a more positive attitude. There's a better can-do attitude in the air. But then you come back to all the kind of complexities of the planning application process and the number of hurdles that need to be jumped over before you get there. No local politician, no planning authority can necessarily drive these things through any quicker at this moment.
No, unless they were already doing it. Like, there are certain boroughs where I think you already had a pretty good political and planning alignment. So Waltham Forest, Brent, where you've got really strong leadership. But probably those boroughs where it was already motoring quite well are being the ones hit by the gateways. And they probably are the ones that are going to slow down, barking Dagenham again. What are you optimistic about in the built environment?
Optimism to pessimism. Well, I kind of get the impression from the discussions I've been having throughout the industry for the last couple of years that there is a better understanding about the place design has in that process. And as an architect, you'd always say design. It's the most important piece of any development. And that design process has to be given time, has to be given space, has to be given financial support. I'll go back to fighting on behalf of architects. The industry needs to understand that architects are at the very front and are kind of key to the quality of design. And yes, they are supported by a whole raft of professionals who've all got their part to play. And I'll go back to it's a team-based effort. But you need to have an architect at the front of that, driving and leading that. And if there's a greater understanding of the value of an architect and the design process, I think we stand a much better chance of producing places and buildings which people like.
On that note, thank you very much, Michael. That was brilliant.
Thank you.